Yuji is back and like maybe immortal or really old, but somehow still the strongest military asset that Japan has access to. Yeah, everything I just said could potentially be true. And here I thought Modulo was gonna involve any of the former characters from JJK, but nope, Yuji Itadori is still out there walking the mean streets of Japan as a 82-year-old. How old was he in JJK? Was he 14 in JJK? He's 15, 83-year-old. But what is Yuji doing as an 83-year-old sorcerer? Is he still truly the strongest that Japan has to offer? And will we see him battling against the Samrians in future chapters of Modulo? Well, today we're gonna be trying to answer all those questions and more, because today we're talking chapter 10 of Modulo Explained. But before we get to talking on the return of JJK's MC, guys, please, or me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you're looking for one additional Nick video every single week, you guys can go ahead and find my Naruto reaction series using the fourth wall link in my description below. We're on to Neji versus Hinata. So, chapter 10 very obviously gave us the massive reveal that not only is Yuji still alive and kicking, but is also still so incredibly powerful that the Japanese government is scrambling to try and find him under the pretense that there might be a war with the Samrians. However, that's not all that's revealed in chapter 10, as this chapter also gave us a fantastic look into the evolving relationship between humanity and the Samrians. The growing resentment, the pressures from the outside to start a conflict on both sides, and how they're going to navigate this incredibly tricky situation moving forward. And therefore, in order to paint the best possible picture for you guys on everything that's happening in Modulo right now, we're gonna have to go over the entire chapter. Now, as the majority of you probably already know, the last two chapters of Modulo, chapter 8 and chapter 9, were flashbacks that gave us the backstory of how the Samrians ended up here on Earth, or at least like in Earth's atmosphere. And thus we learned that the Samrians are actually the Loomer tribe from the planet Samria, who were basically forcibly pushed off their planet by a different tribe of Samrians known as the Diskunte. But now that that backstory has wrapped up and we understand how the Loomer tribe has ended up outside of Earth, on top, inside, do we count the stratosphere as inside the Earth? Above Earth. But in space, above is relative. There's no cardinal direct. I don't know. Anyways, chapter 10 opens with what appears to be the new Jujutsu Council of this era, that being 2086, watching back the fight between Maru and the old man sewing sorcerer, whose name I forget. And they're sitting at a round table, and a projection of the battle is playing between them. And an older, more politician-looking man says, "Are we really going to let this slide?" Now, Usami is also there, just serving face. And as he asks the politician-looking man, "What do you mean by that?" And he retorts back to Usami and says, "Well, aren't we giving those Samrians a little too much freedom? I mean, after all, didn't they reject your request to accompany them? And because you weren't able to accompany them, two sorcerers were rendered unable to fight," referencing Yuta and Tsurugi, who were both somewhat critically injured in the battle against Sewing Needle Grandpa. And even though Malu stepped in to save the day, Malu attacked Tsurugi. Now, at this point that we see Mino kind of freak out, because we see a flashback where Usami is telling Mino to delete all of the footage of Tsurugi and Maru fight. And it's this point that Mino begins to panic as he looks over to Usami, who's not looking at him, as he thinks to himself, I did delete it, Usami, please, trust me. However, because this new council of Jujutsu-based leaders now understands that a Samrian has not only battled against a rogue sorcerer in Sewing Needle Grandpa, but also battled against a contracted sorcerer in Tsurugi, that the Samrians can now be classified under Article 7 of like the Jujutsu Code or something as threats. And like a large part of this chapter is trying to show us how ruling in the Jujutsu society has changed since Yuji and Gojo's era, because we've never really been privy to these high-level conversations before. They all used to take place in a very secretive area filled with old men whose names we didn't know, until for the crime of trying to kill Yuji, Gojo killed them all. Now it appears as though decisions are being made by substantially younger people, and those decisions are being made in some kind of strict adherence to a Jujutsu constitution. Anyways, in response to the idea that Samrians now had to be classified as threats because of the battle that took place between Tsurugi and Maru, Usami says something rather interesting, that there actually is no violation because of the Hikari provision. Now, this elicits surprise reactions out of pretty much everyone on the council, except for a young-looking woman with two buns in her hair, who explains that the Hikari provision was created because a long time ago, there was talks about setting up sanctioned battles between Jujutsu sorcerers as a public spectacle that could be gambled on. Kind of like UFC, but for Jujutsu sorcerers. See, apparently these talks were put into place because after the Culling Games, the government was forced to openly admit that not only Jujutsu sorcerers, but also cursed spirits existed. And therefore, Article 8 of the apparent Jujutsu Constitution, which demanded that all things Jujutsu stay a secret from the general public, was already kind of tossed out the door. So we might as well make battles between high-level Jujutsu sorcerers a public spectacle that the public can bet on. However, this plan never panned out. However, even though this plan to set up battles between sorcerers that people were able to watch and bet on never panned out, the Hikari provision was added into the Jujutsu regulations the last time they did a review of them, which was presumably sometime after the culling game when the generation from Jujutsu Kaisen rose into ruling positions. However, even though these battles between sorcerers were never turned into the public spectacle that Hikari probably wanted, a clause was added into the Hikari provision, which is now in the Jujutsu regulations, that very clearly stated that duels between sorcerers were legal. And thus Usami begins to explain that since Maru, Tsurugi, and Yuka are all under contract with him, as they are both contracted sorcerers engaging in battle against each other, technically no violation has occurred. However, this idea pisses off a couple of the other people in this meeting, as they say, no, the Hikari provision only applies to those who are officially sanctioned sorcerers chosen by headquarters. But Usami counters this argument by saying, but Maru was hired for me as a civilian guard. And thus, once again, the young-looking woman chips in and says, oh, so you're saying that Maru is a latent sorcerer. And it's this point that Mino chips in and says that latent sorcerer often refers to somebody who subconsciously uses jujutsu, and that crimes committed by latent sorcerers are usually forgiven on account of the fact that they don't really know what they're doing. But the council still argues against Usami, as they say it's a well-known fact that all Samrians are able to use cursed energy, to which Usami counters by saying that doesn't mean every single one of them can, as up until this moment there was no confirmation, at least so far as everybody at headquarters knows, that Maru was able to use anything even remotely close to cursed energy. Because when Maru blew away the human trafficker in chapter 1, the only people who were privy to that event were Yuka and Tsurugi. But the council begins to get fed up with Usami as they ask him why he's so hung up on the idea of protecting the Samrians. But Usami turns to him and says, well, why are you so dedicated to opposing them? At which point the man who's been arguing with Usami says, diplomacy falls apart the second you're looked down upon. And we've already been warned once. And by warned, what he's referring to here is when Usami and Mino went on to the Samrian mothership and they invited Dabra to partake in the conversation, which humanity is taking as a show of force by the Samrians, and that's because it probably was. Now the man who's arguing with Usami continues on by saying, we need to show them our strongest card as well. We need to get serious about locating Itadori Yuji. And it's while this is being said that we see an image of a hooded, tall man walking against the grain through a crowd of people. And as we pan in on this hooded figure, we see that he has Yuji's scar. Now, this moment is wild because A, it confirms that Yuji is alive. B, it confirms that he's been hiding from the government. C, it confirms that he is still the strongest sorcerer in Japan. And D, it might confirm that he has some kind of immortality. Because, well, yes, obviously it's not insane that Yuji would be able to survive to 83 years old. Even though the image of Yuji we see, he's wearing a big hood and we can't see the majority of his face, he doesn't look 83. He looks full grown, like an adult, but he looks closer to Usami's age than 83. But how and why is Yuji not aged? Is it because Sukuna's cursed energy still resides inside of him? And Sukuna as an immortal entity has slowed down Yuji's aging? I mean, after all, at the end of JJK, we did see that one of Sukuna's fingers was left behind. Maybe Yuji, in order to make sure that somebody else didn't follow his fate of becoming a vessel of Sukuna, consumed that final finger and is gonna take it out with him when he dies of old age one day. Or maybe Yuji does look 83 under the hood, and when he takes it off, he's gonna be wrinkled and old. Or maybe he made some kind of binding vow to stay alive as long as Mahito could reincarnate. But considering the fact that Mahito seems to be waiting in some kind of limbo for Yuji, as Mahito came face to face with Tsurugi just a couple of chapters ago, and Yuji still appears to be the strongest sorcerer that Japan has access to, maybe Yuji made some kind of binding vow to stay alive until Mahito reincarnated. Who knows? Who can say? We have very little information, but it's wild that Yuji is still alive, still looking young, and still powerful. Anyways, we continue on with this conversation as Usami turns to the man who's arguing against him and says, looked down upon, huh? That may apply when it comes to individuals or even companies, but on the scale of nations, that doesn't make sense. I don't care if you stir things up and feel like you're doing your job, but leave the nation out of it. And the next thing that we see, Usami is leaving the meeting, and he's telling Mino to apologize to everyone for his candor later on. But Mino is telling Usami that he doesn't think he did anything wrong, and that there's nothing to apologize for. But Usami cuts Mino off and says, yeah, but putting effort into finding Yuji is a good idea, and nothing good good ever comes from making enemies amongst your own. And thus there you have it. 10 chapters into Modulo, it's not only been revealed that Yuji is still alive, kicking and powerful, but also we are going to try to find him. So if you JJK fanboys are upset that the main cast hasn't been shown at all in this sequel, boy oh boy do I got news for you. Anyways, we then cut to the Samrian mothership, where we see one of the warriors who was close to Dora talking to what appears to be an older Samrian. And he's asking this older Samrian, who's probably kind of like Jabarama, why does an outsider like Dobra get to make the final decision? What's the point of all of us having voting rights if he gets to veto the choices that we make? At which point the older Samrian lets him know that that's how the unified council system works. The warrior then asks, well then how is that any different from a dictatorship? At which point the older Samrian tells him, well that's what Maru and Cross decided. And it's this point that it gets ever more clear that Maru and Cross are massively important amongst the Samrians. Well, yes, they were obviously incredibly close to Dura, and Dura was the previous chieftain of the Lumer tribe. They were still kids when they left Samrian, or at least were kind of led to believe that. And while, yes, Maru and Cross were the people who made the mothership they're all on right now, not until this moment did it become all that clear how much power Maru and Cross have. Now, the older Samrian continues on by saying that with Dora gone, the most suitable replacement for chieftain was Dobra. And because Dobra is an outsider, he's able to look at the affairs of the Lumer tribe objectively, with no biases. Now, this warrior, whose name is later revealed as Oski, goes on to talk about how he hates those brats, referencing Maru and Cross, how they're arrogant and he feels like they look down on him. He's also not the biggest fan of Dabura on account of the fact that Dabura is basically the reason they were exiled off Samria. But yet the old man asks him if Oski stands a chance in combat against Dabura or even the twins, to which he has no answer on account of the fact that he doesn't stand a chance. Now, rather interestingly, the old man at this point says, calm yourself down. A decision maker, the chieftain, can only reject the decision of the council on the same topic twice. And as Maru's injury, apparently at the hands of the humans, well known throughout the assembly should come to the same decision that they came to previously. Which means essentially what the old man is saying here is that the council has already voted on whether or not they want war with humanity. And the answer they came to was yes. However, Dabura, who humanity believes is the Samrians' greatest weapon, actually vetoed engaging in war with humanity, electing rather to try to coexist with them. And therefore, if the council is able to come to the same conclusion as they came to previously, Dabura may be able to veto it this time. However, that will be the last time he's ever able to veto it. And thus Oski and this old man believe finally their desires are coming to fruition, as they have the chance to take over an island nation with no military of its own. Because if they don't vote for confrontation, if they don't launch an invasion of Japan, they'll be looked down on more and more. And thus, once they invade Japan, the Lumer will become the Discunte, and never again will they have to worry about their things being taken away from them. Now, this is obviously very black and white commentary on the cycle of hatred, and how the oppressed often, when put in a situation where they would be able to oppress others, take that opportunity. But just one layer below that, we can identify a very human thing going on between the Samrians and the Japanese, as both councils have identified that they feel as though they're being looked down on. See, the Samrians themselves have come to Earth and ask for refuge, and thus the proud amongst them believe that they don't need to beg for refuge from this inferior species. However, humanity feels as though they're being looked down upon by the Samrians because the Samrians have shown them their trump card, Dabura, and thus humanity believes as though the Samrians are only biding their time until they launch their invasion. It's the pride of the men involved in both of the councils, both the Samrian and the human councils, that fans the flame of needless conflict, because neither the majority of the Samrians or the majority of humanity will stand to be embarrassed by another species. And I find this very interesting because this kind of rhetoric exists all throughout our modern day globe. Global powers will call themselves underdogs or say that others have infringed upon their rights that allows for them to create a rhetoric that funds an offensive against an objectively weaker force, Israel. And this is being perfectly and purposely put on display, as in this chapter we see the reactions of both humanity and the Samrian councils in response to the news that Maru has been injured by human sorcerers. But speaking of Maru and Cross, the next page shows Cross walking with Jabarama to this council meeting that Oski and the old man have just sat down at. And as the two of them are making their way towards this council meeting, Cross asks Jabarama why he's withheld his vote. At which point Jabarama lets him know it's because Cross has withheld his. It's at this point that Cross, with a stunned expression on his face, flashes back to the conversation that he had with Yuka, where on a walk with Cross, after revealing to Cross that she was gonna die in just a couple of months of brain cancer, she asked him, "You're torn about it too, aren't you, Cross? That's why you disguised yourself as Maru. You wanted to understand us, humanity, better. After which we flash back to Jabarama, who's talking to Cross, saying that you and I both hold 10 votes individually. If we both vote for coexistence, the majority in the council will swing to that of coexistence. However, even if we do vote for war, Dabura may veto it again. So Cross, you make your decision, and I'll follow your lead. To which Cross responds to by saying, don't you have a will of your own, Jabarama? To which Jabarama responds to by saying, trusting somebody is a will in itself. And thus we flash to Cross as he stares at a piece of paper and goes to either vote for coexistence or invasion. And as he stares at this piece of paper, he thinks about all of the connections he's made with humanity. The little girl whose balloon he's returned, Tsurugi apologizing to him, his conversation with Yuka, and he thinks back to the conversation that he had with Dora, where Dora told him that towns and villages are the wills and testaments of those who came before us. However, we see Cross remember that those towns and villages that Dora had so much pride in were destroyed by the Diskunte, and thus we see Cross's face twist into one of agony. And yet Jabarama goes up to tell everybody the results of the vote, where it's revealed that the council has voted in majority for coexistence. And thus Jabarama turns to the council and says, first, let us try to establish a working dialogue with Japan and be open to the prospects of cultural exchange. However, Oski pipes up and says, wait, Jabarama and Cross, you weren't on the side of coexistence before. At which point Cross corrects him and says, we had actually just merely withheld our vote before. But Oski tries to make an appeal to the council saying, Maru's not even here. This vote shouldn't count. But Cross lets him know that Maru's vote was taken before the council meeting, and Maru has always been on the side of coexistence. And thus Oski tries to appeal to Dabura, asking him what he's going to do. At which point Dabura says, well, I don't see a problem with it. Invasion can be started at any time, but the second that invasion is started, coexistence goes out the window. Let's start by getting to know each other. After all, we left Samrian to find our new neighbors, didn't we? And in this moment we can see, even though Dabura doesn't seem all that interested, that his relationship with Dora meant a lot to him. And while he may not be as fervent about how Dora lived his life as Dora was, he is still representing him even now. We then cut to Cross and Jabarama leaving the council meeting, where Jabarama is telling Cross that he's proud of him. But Cross cuts him off and says, don't. I'm just tired is all. We then cut to Usami, Yuka, and Tsurugi meeting with Jabarama and Cross. And we see that Jabarama and Cross are actually lying to Usami about their backstory, as they're telling Usami that Dabura lost in a duel and was exiled off of Samrian, and therefore they followed him. But Usami sees through this immediately, as he realizes that Dabura didn't lose. No, Dabura won, and he took them with him. Now Yuka then chips in and asks Jabarama a question, asking if Kalon, the animal that they see as holy in the Luma tribe, Kalyan, have a lifespan. And if they do, every single one of them dies. The Loomer tribe must. But before she can finish her question, Jabarama cuts her off and says, Kalyan are actually immortal. They cannot die unless they're killed. Which surprises both Yuka and Tsurugi as they begin to understand why the Kalyan would be treated as holy animals. I mean, they're immortal after all. What if Yuji is a Kalyan? He's 83 years old. He doesn't look 83 years old. He looks young. He looks like he's in the prime of his life, even though he shouldn't be. Kalyan have been set up. Later in this chapter, it's established that Kalyan can look like anything, and they are immortal unless killed. I'm not exactly sure how Yuji would be a Kalyan, but what if the answer to the conflict between the Loomer tribe and humanity is the fact that there's a Kalyan on Earth and that Kalyan is Yuji? Which means that Yuji's gonna die because they established that the only time that a member of the Loomer tribe cries is either when they're born, when they die, or when a Kalyan dies. And thus, inevitably, when Yuji enters into a conflict against Dabura and Dabura wins and Yuji dies, all of the members of the Loomer tribe will cry and they'll be like, oh my god, we killed the Kalyan. There was Kalyans here. They're just like us. We need to live amongst them. I mean, that's it. Listen, I understand that none of you want to see Yuji die in the sequel of JJK, and like maybe he'll be able to be brought back to life, but I think that might be it. I hate to say it. No, I don't. I've always been real good at predicting what Gege was thinking of. I'm gonna reread this whole manga and see if there's legs on that theory. Anyways, Usami says, in order to establish some cultural exchange between the two of us here, let's set up a dinner. And thus Jabarama says, yeah, that sounds good. I'll send Cross and Maru to begin the dinner preparations. And thus Yuka, Tsurugi, Maru, and Cross all start cooking. There's a couple of jokes about Japanese cooking delivery TV shows that I don't get, which is fine. It's not an English manga. And Yuka and Tsurugi begin to figure out how they're gonna make this dinner happen. However, before they start cooking, they have to ask Maru and Cross if there's any Samrian specific allergies or dietary restrictions, because the Samrians may not not eat meat, or they may not eat animals that look like a Kalia. And this is kind of a sweet moment because Yuka and Tsurugi are being cognizant, even though they literally just learned about the fact that these Samrians were religious, about the fact that Maru and Cross and all of the Samrians they were going to be feeding are from the Loomer tribe, which is a religious tribe, and thus are trying to make sure that they don't serve them any food that would offend them. However, it's at this point that Cross says, yeah, you don't really need to worry about any of that because Kalyans vary a lot in both form and size, which means hypothetically a Kalyan could maybe, I don't know, look like Yuji. And then they decide to make takoyaki together because Maru tried takoyaki a couple of chapters ago and really liked it. And there's some jokes in there about like takoyaki parties, and somebody gets called Taco Boy, which I'm assuming is like takoyaki boy. It's like Japanese double entendres. Once again, I don't get it. It's a poorly done English translation, but it's not for me. And while Yuka and Maru are really jazzed up about everybody making and eating some takoyaki, Tsurugi and Cross are really nervous about it. And next chapter, we're gonna see the takoyaki party. That's literally how the chapter leaves off. Next time, everyone enjoys the taco pa, which is like takoyaki party. Yeah, a really funny, whimsical, and non-important ending to a chapter that literally reveals that the MC of the previous manga that this manga is based off is alive, kicking into maybe an immortal alien god. But hey, I'll take it. What did you guys think about this chapter? Are you excited that Yuji's back? Are you excited about the prospect of him being some Kalyan? Let me know in the comments below. And do I guys are down there? Please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Listen, I like these characters so much that if the next chapter is just 20 pages of them eating takoyaki, I'll probably live.